Hello everyone, I'm Amadou Boly and I work as Special Assistant to the Chief Economist and Vice President at the African Development Bank. I'm also part of the team of the Irish Research Council project, Corruption, Gender and Sustainable Development, led by Professor Gillanders from DCU Business School and Eugenie Maiga from the University Norbert Zongo in Burkina Faso. Today, I'll briefly discuss some instruments and approaches to successfully fight corruption. Corruption has been identified as one of the greatest obstacles to economic development. So one can easily assume that fighting corruption is a pro-growth policy. Nevertheless, there has been very few success stories in the fight against corruption. In the next slides, I'll share my thoughts on the reason for this lack of success. But let me start by a discussion on a few anti-corruption instruments that have been typically studied in the literature. A first instrument against corruption is monitoring and punishment. This instrument is based on the economics of crime, which says that before engaging in corruption, an individual would weigh the benefits against the cost. And that individual will engage in corruption only if the benefits exceed the cost. Essentially, this instrument can be implemented by either increasing the probability of detection or the penalty if detected, or a combination of both. And this instrument has been shown to work through laboratory experiments as well as empirical studies. A second instrument relates to higher salaries. Paying higher salaries to civil servants amounts to increasing the opportunity cost of corruption, because if caught, the civil servant can lose a high-paying job. And Singapore and Hong Kong are often presented as successful examples for such a policy. A third instrument that is often proposed relates to bottom-up community-based approach to fighting corruption. And this instrument has also been shown to work. For example, in Uganda, Svensson and Reinecke in 2004 studied a newspaper campaign aimed at enhancing the ability of schools and parents to monitor how local officials were handling funds. So providing information to schools and parents allowed to reduce capture from 80% in 1995 to less than 20% in 2001. Which is interesting is that that campaign did not allow to eradicate corruption completely, but there was a significant reduction. A similar result was also found by Franken, Mitten, and Swenen in 2009. A fourth anti-corruption instrument that is also proposed relates to increasing female participation. There's a common belief that women are less susceptible than men to accept bribes. However, results on this gender effect have not been very robust in the literature. The few instruments I have just discussed are part of what I would call the principal-agent framework. This framework assumes that the incentives of the principal and the agent are not fully aligned, which is not necessarily the case with corruption. The principal could benefit from corruption acts. And if that's the case, the principal would have very low incentives to put in place strong anti-corruption institutions. And in a paper with Gillanders in 2018, we found that in weak institutional environments, public officials, even when non-corrupt, would significantly weaken anti-corruption institutions. This highlights one of the key issues in fighting corruption because there could be collusion between the principal and the agent. The second aspect that I would like to bring here relates to what we call the legitimacy effect in a paper with Gillanders and Mintinen in 2019. In fact, we found that the effects of an anti-corruption policy are weaker when chosen by a corrupt official compared to an honest official. And this is really important because what he says is that action speak louder than policies. The implementer of a policy needs to be perceived as legitimate, else the targeted effects of the policy would not work. And this also applies to corruption. In the next slides, I will discuss how one can successfully fight corruption. This discussion is based on a chapter that I co-wrote with Gillanders in 2023, titled Corruption, Institutional Trust and Legitimacy, a Vicious Circle. And it was published in a book called The Political Economy of Corruption. In my earlier slide, I referred to a legitimacy effects in the fight against corruption. And to break out of this legitimacy trap, we need top leaders to show through their own words and actions a zero tolerance for corruption. A case in point is Thomas Sankara, former president of Burkina Faso, whose rhetoric focused heavily on anti-corruption principles. And he went as far as renaming the country, Burkina Faso, the land of incorruptible men from Upper Volta. In 1987, Thomas Sankara's regime was overthrown and corruption gradually increased again in Burkina Faso. Such an outcome suggests that the emergence of a public-minded leader is a necessary but not a sufficient condition, as these reformers could face strong opposition due to powerful interests that benefits from corruption. To possibly decrease resistance, leaders can develop a strategy based on a gradual approach by directing anti-corruption efforts to critical sectors such as courts, custom, education, or to those where corruption is perceived as acute by the public. This could increase the chance of success. Of course, a legitimate action is how one can obtain a leader that is fully committed to fighting corruption. Part of the answer is serendipity. Also, efforts to raise citizens' awareness on the decisive role of leadership could create some pressure so that there's a change in behavior and commitment to fighting corruption. A venue to be explored is what I call the African Presidential Performance Index, a topic that I discussed in an opinion piece that was published in DEVEX in 2023. Compared to the case of Burkina Faso, Singapore demonstrates the long-term aspects of successful anti-corruption reforms. Essentially, the anti-corruption strategy of Singapore was implemented by the People's Action Party, which has been ruling for several decades. A consistent and lasting implementation that seeks to reduce both the opportunities and incentives for corruption partly explains that success. Another aspect in successfully fighting corruption relates to international cooperation, which is critical in discouraging corruption by top officials, by restricting illegal outflows or by facilitating asset recovery. An illustrative example relates to former Nigerian President Sami Abacha, who managed to deposit 2.4 billion USD abroad, and Nigeria is yet to fully recover these funds. International and bilateral partners through development assistance could also help in the fight against corruption by providing incentives to leaders or by justifying anti-corruption measures that might otherwise be challenging to implement. In conclusion, the literature on corruption points out to several instruments and approaches. We've discussed the principal agent framework as well as some of the issues and provided some venues that are worth exploring. But in my view, the importance of top leadership for success cannot be overstated. Given how difficult corruption has proved to curb, never mind eradicate, we also need to better understand the political economy of fighting corruption. The instruments are known, but why is it that they are not implemented? Or why is it that when they are implemented, they are ineffective or they have worked in other contexts? So it's really important to look at this aspect. And I think that the idea of legitimacy traps warrants further exploration. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I hope you've enjoyed this brief course on fighting corruption, and I look forward to recording more successes in the fight against corruption in the near future so that we can boost socio-economic development in our respective countries. Have a nice day.